July 24, 1944. A pulverized stretch of orchard west of Saint-Lô, Normandy. The air is thick, suffocating, not just with the summer heat, but with the cloying, metallic dust of pulverized stone and high explosive residue. It coats the throat, stings the eyes, and settles like a shroud over the shattered landscape. A faint, sickening smell of decay drifts from the dense hedgerows, the infamous bocage that has turned the American advance into a grinding, yard-by-yard nightmare. Inside the close confines of his camouflaged bunker, Major Hans-Peter Müller, commanding the artillery of the 352 Infanterie-Division, presses a field telephone receiver hard against his ear. The line crackles with static and the distant roar of a massive bombardment. Müller, a gaunt man whose uniform seems several sizes too large after weeks of relentless fighting, studies the map pinned to the rough-hewn wall. His sector is the hinge point, the anchor for the entire German defense around the shattered city of Saint-Lô. The key terrain. Herr Major, the voice of his forward observer, Lieutenant Krissig, is strained, barely audible over the line. They are forming up again. The Americans, northwest of the Perriers Road. It's not just infantry this time. Heavy movement. We estimate an armored concentration. 3, perhaps for companies of the Shermans. Müller's pencil halts above the map. 3 weeks. For 3 weeks since the landing, his division, already decimated, has held the line against relentless American pressure, transforming the bocage into a meat grinder. The cost was paid in blood and steel, but they had maintained the solid, unbroken front that Hitler demanded. The American forces, pinned down by the terrain and the dense, accurate German defensive fire, had been bled white in the hedgerow hell. But now this, an armored concentration. Krissig, listen closely, Müller says, his voice a low, steady rumble despite the knot of anxiety tightening in his stomach. They are preparing an attack. This is what the Americans call Operation Cobra. Our intelligence was right. This is their breakout attempt. We will not give an inch. Prepare for the heaviest barrages we have ever fired. Concentrate everything on the approach routes. No hesitation. We stop them before they even cross the start line. Outside, the heavy, earth-shaking thump-thump-thump of the American medium artillery begins again. The preliminary softening up fire that precedes every push. Müller glances at his watch. 9 o'clock hours. The ground vibrates beneath his feet. The Americans would find no soft spots today. The 352 would meet their tanks with the full fury of their remaining 7.5 centimeters Pak 40 anti-tank guns, and the storm of their 10.5 centimeters LEF-H-18 howitzers. He had the reserves, the ammunition, and the resolve. The steel fist of the German defense was coiled and ready to strike. The strike came, not as a subtle push, but as a tectonic eruption. At 11 o'clock hours, the sky tore open. 2,000 American bomber sorties, B-17 flying fortresses, and B-24 Liberators roared overhead, delivering an unimaginable, concentrated tonnage of high explosives. This was not the preliminary fire. This was an airstrike designed to utterly obliterate everything. In a 7-square-kilometer corridor, the earth seemed to gasp. Major Müller's bunker shuddered violently, dust sifting through every crack. The roar was so absolute, so physically overwhelming, that it felt as if the air itself had been turned into a solid, vibrating wall. The bombardment was devastating, shattering the German front-line units, burying men alive, and vaporizing field positions. When the last plane passed, the silence that followed was even more unnerving than the noise. A heavy, ringing void punctuated by the desperate cries of the wounded. Lieutenant Krissig, miraculously surviving the deluge in a deep trench, staggered back to his observation post. Through the dense, yellowish-brown dust cloud that hung over the entire sector, he could make out the immediate consequences: a moonscape of smoking craters, shredded trees, and the sickening, burnt metal smell of devastation. Report, Krissig, Müller yelled into the phone, his ears still ringing. The line is broken, Major. The forward infantry company. It's gone. Nothing but holes. But wait, the tanks are moving. Through the billowing dust and smoke, a synthetic fog bank created by the bombing. Krissig saw the first shapes, not the cautious, creeping infantry patrols the Americans usually sent out after a bombardment, but large, bulky shapes moving with a startling, organized speed. They were the Emperor Sherman medium tanks of the U.S. 2nd Armored Division, and they were advancing straight into the teeth of the remaining German positions. Müller, momentarily stunned by the speed of the follow-up attack, slammed his fist onto the map table. No time to rally the infantry. Bring the guns to bear. Full concentration. Every remaining pack and howitzer. Target the dust cloud. Density fire. Give me a wall of steel. Krieg. Now. Within minutes, the German artillery, operating from hardened positions slightly behind the main blast zone, responded with a furious, coordinated defensive fire. 105 mm and 150 mm shells howled through the smoke-filled air, raining down in a dense, calculated pattern. It was a perfect, pre-registered hurricane of artillery, the absolute maximum defensive effort a battered German unit could muster. Tree bursts, air-detonating shells designed to tear open the lighter armor and vulnerable infantry riding the tanks exploded with terrifying frequency. The barrage was so heavy that Krieg reported the area looked like a perpetual flash of fire and secondary dust plumes. Nothing should have been able to pass through that inferno. But then, through a momentary lull in the smoke, Krieg saw the impossible. The Shermans were still advancing. They were driving straight through the curtain of explosions. They were not maneuvering to avoid the shells. They were using the very dust and smoke of the relentless artillery fire as cover, a strange, terrifying shield. The German gunners, hardened veterans who had fought across France and Russia, were firing their masterpiece defense, and the American steel simply ignored it, pushing forward into the heart of the line. They are not stopping. They are not turning. Krieg screamed into the telephone, the raw panic in his voice a new sound to Major Müller. They are using their own artillery. It is moving. The American guns are firing just ahead of them. It's a rolling barrage, but they are moving inside the curtain. They are sheltered by the smoke of their own shells. This was the terrifying realization for the German command. The U.S. forces, specifically the tank crews and armored infantry of the 2nd Armored Division, had devised a brutal, ingenious tactic tailored for this breakout. They were not trying to outflank the German fire. They were embracing the chaos. The American tanks were deliberately hugging the exploding shells of their own artillery. An unprecedented display of calculated aggression. The U.S. Army's barrage, hundreds of rounds falling every minute, created a dense, moving wall of pulverized earth and smoke that advanced relentlessly. The key was the dust. The intense American bombardment had churned the dry Norman soil into a fine, suffocating powder. When the German artillery began to drop into this environment, each explosion didn't just throw shrapnel. It kicked up enormous, blinding columns of dirt. The effect was a thick, impenetrable fog bank that moved alongside the tanks, masking their exact numbers, speed, and direction from the few surviving German forward observers like Krieg. "My gunners cannot range them, Major," Krieg cried, choking on the dusty air. "They are firing blind into the smoke. The pack crews, they can only see muzzle flashes, not the Shermans themselves." The German 7.5 centimeters Pak-40 anti-tank gun was a deadly weapon, fully capable of knocking out a Sherman at long range, but it required a target, a clear line of sight. The Americans had denied them that. Driving through a hurricane of fire became an act of strategic deception, the physical and psychological shockwave of the German shells merely adding to the visual noise, making it impossible to spot the fleeting, angular shapes of the advancing tanks. The U.S. tank commander leading the charge, Captain Abe the Ram Johnson, sat perched in the open hatch of his Sherman, Hellcat, guiding his column by compass and the sound of his own side's artillery impact. He was operating on faith that the gunners behind him would maintain the perfect distance of a few hundred yards between the shell impacts and his lead vehicle. If the barrage lagged, his unit would be exposed. If it fell short, they would be obliterated by their own supporting fire. It was a gamble of extreme audacity, trading personal risk for strategic momentum. Suddenly, a massive thwack ripped through the air next to Johnson's tank. A German 88mm shell, fired on speculation through a gap in the smoke, had missed by scant feet. The near miss momentarily rattled the captain, but he leaned forward, shouting above the engine's roar to his driver, Sergeant Eddie Bull O'Malley. "Keep the throttle buried, Sergeant. Stay glued to that smoke. If you can't see the trees, they can't see us. Push, push." The tanks pushed. They smashed through the remaining German wire and what little defensive rubble was left. The first few Shermans breached the line not through superior firepower, but through an utterly terrifying, relentless forward momentum that defied every tenet of defensive warfare Major Müller had ever learned. The Germans were being defeated by their own lack of visibility. Major Müller stood in the gloom of his bunker, the field telephone silent in his hand. The last report from Kreisig had been incoherent, a burst of shouts and static followed by dead air. The German defensive fire was still roaring, a magnificent and terrifying volume of metal. But it was now a ghost barrage, shells exploding on ground already passed by the enemy. He could hear, faintly, the unmistakable, higher-pitched rattle of .50 caliber machine gun fire, the distinct sound of advancing American armor operating in close quarters. The breach was complete. The German armored reserve, what little of it remained, a handful of Panzerivs and a few supporting Sturmgeschütz, 3 assault guns, had been caught flat-footed by the speed of the breakout. They had been positioned too far back, expecting the Americans to halt and consolidate after the initial breach. Instead, Captain Johnson's column, followed by waves of additional armor, was already pouring through the corridor, its objective not a fortified position, but open ground. Müller walked stiffly to his map, the thick red line denoting the main German defense, painstakingly held for weeks, was now a tattered, fragmented scrap of paper. The Americans had not merely bent the line, they had shattered it along a narrow, crucial axis. The tanks had bypassed the strong points, driving deep into the rear area, effectively isolating the remaining forward units. For the German command, the stunning truth of Operation Cobra was not just the overwhelming air power, but the psychological and tactical shock of the U.S. response. Never before had they encountered an enemy so willing to operate so recklessly close to their own heavy artillery barrage. It was an innovation born of desperation in the bocage, and it worked with brutal efficiency. Within the next 48 hours, the gap would widen into a 20-mile breach, tearing open the entire western flank of the German front. The American tanks, now out of the constricting hedgerows, would roar into the open plains of France. The resulting rush, what the Germans would grimly call the Great Retreat, would culminate in the encirclement of large German forces in the Falaise pocket. The stunning advance through the artillery hurricane proved to be the surgical cut that finally bled the German army in Normandy. Later that evening, Müller managed to reach his regimental commander, Colonel Klaus Richter, by radio. The colonel, his voice tight with fatigue, simply issued the order that defined the German fate in Normandy. "Major, gather what remains of your command. Destroy all non-essential equipment and all remaining ammunition. The order is a tactical withdrawal. Move east. The front has ceased to exist." The colonel paused, a heavy silence hanging on the line before he spoke again, his voice barely a whisper. "They drove through everything, Major. They drove through God's own thunder. We were simply not prepared for that kind of audacity." Müller nodded slowly, though Richter could not see him. The audacity. It was more than a tactic. It was a fundamental shift in the rhythm of the war. As the remnants of the 352 Infanterie-Division began their bitter, defeated march eastward, the sound of distant American tank engines, the sound of the breakout followed them. Like the relentless drumming of fate, Normandy had been lost in the dust and the smoke of that incredible, unstoppable advance.